When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Comedy YouTube channel. Today's video is going to be kind of a longer one, probably. It's going to be basically all about House Hightower. And what I want to talk about in this video, specifically by kind of what you guys have seen in the title and the thumbnail, is how did House Hightower, one, make it all the way to the current story with kind of still having most of their power, being extremely wealthy, extremely powerful. Like, one of our notes for House Hightower at the end of the story, or I guess the current story right now, they are as rich as House Lannister and also can field 3 times as many men as any bannerman of the Tyrells. How were they able to keep their majority of their power, whereas House Velaryon, who we looked at in a previous video, they were not able to? So I thought this family fit in perfectly with the channel, with talking about a house that was very prominent in the Dance of the Dragons and House of the Dragon as a whole, and also a house that's very mysterious in A Song of Ice and Fire, and is actually not a very prominent house. Like, we don't see them very often. They are still very powerful, but we just don't see them very much. So, again, there will be spoilers in this video for Dance of the Dragons or House of the Dragon, the television show. If you do not want spoilers, I would stick clear of this video, especially when we start hitting onto that area. I will try to mention it again once we start getting into that topic, but that's going to be a huge part of it. And another thing I wanted to kind of look at, what is House Hightower up to? And why have we not seen their liege lord right now? Or why have we not seen Lord Leighton Hightower, the current Lord of Hightower, in over a decade? So we're going to be talking about a lot of things here. And yeah, so strap in, get yourself a snack. It's going to be a longer video, and let's get into it. But before we do, if you guys like to like, subscribe, and comment, please do. It helps the channel grow, reach people that might like this content as well. And let's get into the video. So, for House Hightower, we're going to start with their origins. So, we are not sure where House Hightower actually originates. It is kind of widely assumed that they were first men, but another suggestion is that they came from traders and seafarers. I personally probably believe they were first men, but either way, they first settle in the black stone fortress of Battle Isle. And at the beginning, much like much of Westeros, they were self-styled kings. So everyone at this time, before we see Aegon's conquest, was like, I'm the king here, I'm the king there. So, for instance, what we saw is, in the Reach, especially early on, it was kind of like the Gardeners and the Hightowers. They're like your two major powers in the Reach. And then also House Hightower had to deal with the Greyjoys raiding them a lot. And also, they also had issues with the Dornish as well. As Hightower, like, they kind of sit right where the Dornish would, like, come up from. So very open to attack. So we've talked about this with Darkstar. If he comes up north with some of the Dornish army, House Hightower's right there. So early on in House Hightower's development, something that we'll kind of get to a little bit in a second, is that they were getting attacked a lot early on in their civilization here in Westeros. Now, it would appear that someone else before the Hightowers had actually founded the first Old Town, which eventually the Hightowers would reside in, which is an interesting question. Like, who did actually reside here before the Hightowers? Did the Hightowers just get rid of them? Like, just kill them off and just take their land and what they had already built? We're not sure. We don't have any real clear answer on that. But I don't know. I'd be interested to hear what you guys think about that. There was someone else that was here before the Hightowers. We don't really know who. And they would reside in Battle Isle until finally the Hightower was built. So the first person that we know of in House Hightower is King Uther of the High Tower, who commissions Bran the Builder to build a 5th tower made completely of stone. So the big thing here of why we see a lot of the towers being built and all of that idea is because, like I had talked about, the Hightowers get invaded quite a lot. And one of the big things is that House Hightower kept rebuilding and built higher walls and towers until they were able to defend themselves. It's kind of a story like the Baratheon Castle Storm's End, except it's kind of a different idea. That one, it's more against the elements of the wind and of possible God. In this, it's more or less against human forces. They just had to keep rebuilding until they could defend themselves. So that's kind of how House Hightower builds up their fortress and is able to be in such a they're in a really bad position when you think about it. When it comes to neighbors, they're able to be attacked from so many different areas, but they eventually do figure it out. Now, King Uther's sons, King Erugion, he would eventually become the king, and Prince Paramore the Twisted were integral in the foundation of the Citadel. So this is something I wanted to bring up because it shows the deep ties to the Citadel that the Hightowers do have. So when we talk about theories like, oh, Otto Hightower and the Maesters were probably buddy-buddy and trying to get the Hightowers in a bigger position or trying to get rid of the dragons, this is where those things originate, because these two like ideas, the Citadel and the Hightowers, are directly correlated. And the Hightowers themselves have people that are in the Citadel, right? One of the Grand Maesters of the Citadel is a Hightower at some point during the story. So that's why we kind of look at them and go, okay, this is why they have such deep ties to them. And House Hightower is a very mysterious house in general. They do a lot of things that we're not given really a full explanation on, but we know there's something kind of going on there. It just, we're left to kind of infer it by George. Now, we also note here that in the early ages of Old Town, with them being attacked a lot, Old Town was actually sacked multiple times by, again, the Greyjoys, the Dornish, the Gardeners. So that kind of led House Hightower to kind of protecting it better, and they finally able to get to that position like I talked about a little bit earlier. Now, this is still before Aegon's conquest. So, again, when Aegon comes over, the Hightowers are not actually kings anymore. They'd actually married into the Gardener Kingdom. And this was, again, this shows actually how powerful the Hightowers were, that they were never actually taken over by conquest. They actually marry. So what ends up kind of happening and why they're okay with marrying into the Gardener kind of kingdom is because Lymond Hightower and King Garland, Gardner II kind of make this pact where Lymond the Sea Lion wed the daughter of Garland, while Garland put aside his own wives to marry Lymond's daughter. And that kind of wed House Garner to House Hightower, and now they were kind of like interlocked now. So both of them, they basically expand their kingdoms without any conquest, and they're much more powerful. If you're thinking about invasions from the Dornish, if you think about invasions from, say, the Greyjoys, or maybe the Riverlands or the Westerlands, they're much more powerful now that they can together probably put down a lot of those. So it's a marriage and a pact that makes a lot of sense for both parties. This pact helped them out significantly because they're both able to keep themselves safe, and also when the Andal invasion happens, they ally with them almost immediately. And this kind of allowed them to specifically keep their lands and wealth. And it's something we're going to see House Hightower do quite a lot. House Hightower, for the most part, usually backs the right side. There's someone that usually stays out of the conflict, and they pick the right side, either gaining them more power or letting them keep their own power. They are very rarely on the losing side. We see it happen a couple times. If you want to talk about the Dance of the Dragons, technically, actually, spoiler for House of the Dragon before I go any further, but technically in the Dance of the Dragons, they are the losers because Otto/Alicent's line dies. Like, their line dies out, whereas Rhaenyra's line continues, even though Aegon II kills Rhaenyra. So theoretically, you can make the argument that both sides won, but again, really both sides lose in that conflict anyway. In Aerys the Mad King's reign, when Robert rebels against the crown, House Hightower picks the losing side. They choose Aerys. They don't really lose anything because of it, but they do end up being on the losing side. They're not usually on the losing side, though, so I want to make that point there, that usually they pick the right side, which allows them to gain more power. Now, over the years leading up to Aegon's conquest, the Hightowers really had nothing to worry about militarily because of the backing by the Gardeners. They were able to basically, since they don't have to worry about that, they can now grow in wealth. Now, this is something we saw with House Velaryon, is that they were able to, through trade, they become one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in Westeros. Now, this is something that I want to also bring up and I want to talk about, is when we talk about House Hightower. In a lot of ways, in my opinion, House Hightower should be the Lords of the Reach. It really shouldn't be House Tyrell, and the reason it's House Gardener is because Hightower is married into House Gardener. And I know that eventually, House Hightower does marry into House Tyrell as well. But it is interesting when you think about Aegon's conquest that House Hightower wasn't instantly made the Lords of the Reach. Maybe this is done by House Targaryen because they don't want the Faith to be like the capital of the Reach and give them that power as well. But it's an interesting idea because in all regards, House Hightower is usually stronger or at least an equal to their liege lord in either the Gardeners or the Tyrells. Now, the Hightowers were basically the first to take up the Seven. They are the ones that kind of started and start to spread it with the Faith, and they gave patronage to the Faith by making the first High Septon and also the Starry Sept for them. Now, again, they are involved directly in who they want to be the first High Septon, and they give them their place of, I guess, worship. Again, showing the Hightowers have crafted all of these things that can be used to gain House Hightower power. If you really think about it, they can use a lot of these things to create issues. If you think about House Targaryen, when Maegor the Cruel is trying to get a relationship and the Faith to give him who he's going to marry, because again, Maegor wanted to marry someone else. He wanted to marry another Targaryen. We're not going to get into that really in this video too much, but the Faith says no, and then what do? They say, oh, marry a Hightower. You see how this, like, down the line makes a lot of sense for why those things happen? Why do the Hightowers get very beneficial matches at times? Now, again, it is because they are a very strong family already, but also they have the backing of the Faith, of the Maesters. They have a lot of people that are in very influential positions to help get them more power. And to really hammer the nail in of how powerful the Hightowers were before the conquest, families like the Peaks, there was other families, I didn't note them all down, but a family like the Peaks who weren't that terribly strong at this point, boasted of marrying into this family. That's how awesome it was to be in the Hightower family, that you were like, yeah, I'm, married in the Hightower family. I have their backing. You can't touch me. So that's kind of just a brief little summary of the origins of House Hightower and kind of what they're about, which is going to lead us to kind of the age of the Targaryens. It's going to lead us into Targaryen rule and what House Hightower did during this time. So, again, we see that during Aegon's conquest, House Hightower is actually very smart. House Gardener basically says, okay, we're going to go to the Field of Fire. It wasn't called the Field of Fire by House Gardener, but they were like, we're going to go and we're going to take on Aegon. And House Hightower says, no, we're not going to. Which is interesting because, like we just talked about, House Hightower is directly related to House Gardener at this point. And they said, nah, you'll be fine. And they are out. Now, House Hightower, in my opinion, begrudgingly bends the knee to Aegon. But what doesn't, again, I don't see why. I mean, I can see why Aegon gave the Lord of the Reach to the Tyrells, because the Tyrells helped open the gates to Highgarden, didn't make a conflict. They showed their, I guess, loyalty to the Targaryens. But House Hightower was much more important and valuable to Aegon than Highgarden was. So what ends up happening here is we see that Aegon flies his dragon on Dragonback to Old Town. Manfred Hightower opens his gates, bends the knee, while Aegon was anointed the King of Westeros by the High Septon. Now, again, I don't really think this is what House Hightower wanted, just based upon their actions and also the Faith's actions later on. But that's what happens for now. Now, as I talked about a little bit earlier, Old Town was a huge objector to incest, right? We see this as a major factor during Aenys and also Maegor's reign, is that they don't want to see incest. And instead of Maegor marrying Rhaena, he instead marries Cersei Hightower. Now, this shows one thing that I think is very important to understand, is this is kind of the foreshadowing of the dance, where it's trying to get it's trying to get a Hightower in a position of more power with the Targaryens. This will not be the last time we see this. Even after Alicent, the Hightowers still marry into the Targaryen family. But this, for the most part, is the first step to the Hightowers trying to take that leap of getting their blood on the throne. Now, we see that this doesn't go to plan. Cersei is not able to really give children to Maegor, and Maegor eventually says, okay, she's infertile, I need a new wife so I can have heirs, and he marries someone else, and this causes an issue where he eventually gets exiled. Cersei goes back to her home. Now, a few years later, the two would reconcile, and she would come back to King's Landing, but this doesn't really fix the issue. House Hightower still isn't really, like, they're on the throne, but not really, because, again, no heirs come from Cersei anyway. And we even see that in 41 AC, because this is very important to what happens with Maegor's plot, Manfred Hightower is succeeded by his son Martin Hightower. And we see that House Hightower was directly supporting the warrior's son. Martin's brother, Sir Morgan, was the only one spared by Maegor. Again, showing a little bit of that, A, we're going to play both sides, and two, obviously House Hightower is not a fan of the Targaryens, of their dragons, of their incest. Interesting that we specifically get that note that a Hightower was in the warrior's sons. Now, Cersei Hightower dies about 2 years later, after this event in 45 AC, without giving Maegor an heir. That is huge, because now Maegor's line, for the most part, ends, because even his other wives don't give him any children. But for House Hightower, it cuts all ties to Maegor at this point. It kind of frees them to do whatever they want to do. It's similar to, if we're going to look at like House Tyrell in the normal story, where the reason House Hightower is even still backing House Lannister is, one, because Margaery is married to Tommen. So if that was to not happen, or if Margaery was to die, Tyrell would be very easily able to switch sides. And that's kind of what House Hightower really does here. So there's this idea before that Rhaella Targaryen had been sent to Old Town to be a septa, but once Rhaena leaves Maegor basically goes, okay, well, kill Rhaella. She was a hostage, and Martin kind of doesn't do anything at this point. He more or less just says, yeah, no, not going to happen, imprisons the messenger, and pledges for Jaehaerys instead. So we see how House Hightower is they are very resourceful and see when the tide is switching, and they go to Jaehaerys right before. So again, they'd played both sides, if you think about it. They were with Maegor when he was at his strongest, and then they jumped on Jaehaerys' ship when he was at his strongest. So again, House Hightower is not the most loyal house in the world, and they really are in it for themselves, which is what a lot of houses are, but House Hightower does it better than most. And this will kind of continue us into Jaehaerys' reign, and also into Viserys' reign. So again, if you do not want House of the Dragon spoilers, this is probably where I would click off of the video. We're going to be getting into a lot of the spoilers that happen, a lot of things that are very important to the story, and to House Hightower as a whole, and to understanding them. So again, if you do not want Dance of the Dragons or House of the Dragon spoilers, I would click off now. We see the Hightowers at this point playing a heavy role in not only the end of Jaehaerys' reign, but also throughout Viserys' reign, which is fairly obvious to anyone that has read the book. House Hightower kind of gets into a big power grab at this situation where Otto Hightower is the hand of the king all throughout this time period, and he was pretty much ruling for Jaehaerys in his later stages. Otto's daughter Alicent was in a place where she was very close to Jaehaerys. There's rumors that Alicent had some sort of sexual relations with Jaehaerys, which I very much don't think happened. But we also see how this continues over, where Alicent starts, then being with Viserys. Otto Hightower still being hand of the king, and for the most part ruling instead of Viserys. And again, I want to preference this by saying we're going off the book lore, not the show lore. Because the book lore, Viserys, for the most part, doesn't do anything, and he gets manipulated very easily by Otto. He's a very dumb character. It's one of the better changes of the show. And we kind of just see this Hightower takeover. Really is what happens. King's Landing starts to be this Hightower just place. Hangout place for all Hightower supporters. The Blacks, or Rhaenyra specifically, and Daemon as well, just kind of get pushed out of King's Landing, to the point where Rhaenyra has to go to Dragonstone. We see how Otto Hightower and Daemon's rivalry continues, and we're not exactly sure why. I think it's usually just, I think I would probably put it up to one, that Daemon is this great warrior. He has a dragon. He's a big threat to the Hightower takeover that Otto's kind of planning in the back of his head. And also this idea that the Maesters want to get rid of the dragons and all of these really wild Targaryens. Also, it probably doesn't help that there's this rumor that Daemon took Alicent's virginity. So yeah, there's a lot of things there that kind of build to Otto's hate of Daemon. And Otto is pretty much Hand of the King for a while until he eventually gets dismissed by Viserys. Now, it's a bit different in the book. In the book, it's basically Otto just keeps nagging Viserys about the succession. And Viserys is just like, dude, I'm tired of your shit. You bring it up like every day. Leave. And for a while, Otto's out. Eventually, Otto comes back in anyway. But we also see kind of the Maesters manipulating Viserys into marrying Alicent. And I talked about this. The only option that Viserys is given is like I don't remember how old Laena is, but I think she's like 7 or something, or 10. Somewhere around there. She's very young. The only option for Viserys is that. And Viserys at this point of his life, he's kind of getting older. He doesn't want this young girl who he's going to have to wait a while before she can even give him children. You kind of understand why Viserys goes, oh yeah, why don't I just pick Alicent, who's in the I think in the story she's 19 in the books, and she's described as being very beautiful. Why would Viserys not choose her? I mean, I know like politically. Now again, if we're going politically, the marriage to Laena makes way more sense. The Hightowers are already in Viserys' pocket, whereas the Velaryons are not, and this is a huge thing that would piss them off. Also, Alicent was not specifically like offered to Viserys. Viserys kind of chooses her. So you wouldn't have pissed off House Hightower either, because it wasn't like this personal like betrothal that Otto was offering Viserys. So again, we kind of see some manipulation there, just the way Otto positions Alicent to get close to Viserys to where he would make this decision. Also, there's no other candidates that are really given to Viserys that make any real sense. So it's kind of just like, they don't specifically tell Viserys to do it, but they push him kind of down that road. And this kind of created an entirely new issue of succession. Because the issue is here now, who should rule? Rhaenyra or Alicent's first child that was a boy, and that was Aegon. And it creates this entire issue that plagues this time period, and it's all because the Hightowers want more power, they want their line on the throne. And we also see another interesting idea here, is that Otto played a very integral role in getting Daemon out of power in King's Landing, to the point where Viserys removes him from the city. Because what's interesting is that Otto continuously keeps giving Daemon worse and lesser powers, but Daemon makes the best of him. Like, he's the captain of the Gold Cloaks. He does a very good job with that, gains a ton of power, and Otto's like, yeah, that's not good, let's get him out of here. And eventually he's removed from the city. Now, another very oddly suspicious idea going on between the Hightowers and the Maesters during this time period was the idea of, who should we let Rhaenyra marry? And it's very odd to me that in the chapter where we get this, in the page specifically where they're talking about who Rhaenyra should marry, everyone's like Laenor. Which again, politically, it kind of makes sense on the face value of it, because you get House Velaryon back into the fold, and maybe this makes them happy, maybe. And the whole problem here is, though, everybody in the room says Laenor is gay. And what do the maester that's in the room say? He says, oh, well, he'll figure it out. Like, yeah, the dude is either bisexual or gay, probably gay. He's just going to figure out how to like women now, all of a sudden. Like, this whole idea here, in my opinion, was to set up Rhaenyra to fail. This idea here is that Rhaenyra is going to marry someone that's not going to give her children, and Rhaenyra, understandably so, is going to look for some male companionship somewhere else, and now you can do a whole smear campaign on her. In my opinion, this was a setup. Like, it's an obvious setup that, to me, shows how cunning the Maesters and Otto Hightower were. And basically what I'm trying to get at is what we really see here during this time period. It is more or less a smear campaign on anyone opposing Alicent's children. So Rhaenyra, she gets smeared. Daemon gets smeared. All of these characters, their reputations are destroyed in King's Landing because of the Hightowers specifically. Now, I will say, these characters don't help themselves. They do things that are very rash and not very smart that play into it, but the Greens definitely are the ones that go about doing that. And I don't blame them either. That's what you need to do. If you're Otto Hightower or you're Alicent, how do you get to a position where your children sit the throne more easily? You make the other side look more illegitimate, and you put forward that yours are males. Rhaenyra, she's a female, and you go down that road. And that's exactly what the Greens do. It's why they're so successful and on gaining so many allies to their side. And again, like I said, the Hightowers gain a lot of power in King's Landing. Second in command of the City Watch was Gawain Hightower. Also, the army in the Reach was led by Lord Ormond Hightower and includes 2 more Hightower knights. The Hightowers were just in a very strong position right now. There's nothing really else to say. And I'm not going to specifically go into the war on every single dealing of the Hightowers. I want to really focus on what happens at the end and how this devastates House Hightower, what it does to their family, and really show how impressive it is that they recover from this event. So, long story short, this would decimate the power everywhere, but it hit the Hightowers even harder. They were a leading family in this war, just like the Velaryons, and by the end of the war, only Jaehaera Targaryen, Helena's daughter, would survive from Alicent's line, all while Otto, his brother Ormond, and their cousin Sir Bryden died during this conflict. Now, the people who stepped up in their places, Hobart Hightower stepped up to lead the Southern Army, which he wasn't very effective. He wasn't really a good leader. And Ormond Hightower was succeeded by his son, Lionel. So again, we see that kind of House Hightower, they dwindle in number quite a bit. We don't know specifically. There isn't a great family tree for House Hightower at this point when it comes to outside of the main people. But just know that their house really was decimated after this conflict. And that kind of leads us into Lionel's reign as head of House Hightower. And he had a very important job. He is basically taking over right after the Dance of the Dragons. He has a lot he needs to kind of do. And he kind of starts out in an interesting place. He marries Samantha Tarly, his stepmother. Very odd marriage. And this is seen as incest by Old Town, but they don't do anything. Which shows a little bit of that bias towards House Hightower that nothing is done here, because if the Targaryens did this a bit more, there would be some issues. Either way, but Samantha Tarly, just a notable thing to note out, is that she actually did create the Bank of Old Town. Again, after this point, we really don't have a ton of information on House Hightower. They do some things that are kind of minor here and there, but for major things, they very much stay out of the public eye. A lot of this time period after the Dance of the Dragons is about rebuilding the Hightower power and continuing just getting back into their wealthy status, which they lost a little bit during the dance, but they definitely recoup it by the main story. And one thing that I want to talk about when looking at House Velaryon and also House Hightower and why one was successful where the other was not. House Hightower, for the most part, didn't lose their source of income, right? They still traded heavily in Old Town. It was one of the biggest areas of trade. House Velaryon never had that. House Velaryon got their trade off of King's Landing, off of being the master of ships, off of controlling the Stepstones. And after the war, or the Dance of the Dragons, their fleet is decimated. They, for one, don't control the Stepstones anymore. 2, they aren't really in control of King's Landing, like the ports, to get there anymore, so they're not really getting as much profits. Whereas House Hightower is able to really just continue to grow as long as they don't get into more wars and stuff like that. And we see that they actually stick out of the next war. And even with House Hightower just having a Targaryen marriage with Alicent and Viserys, we actually see that Daemon's daughter, Rhaena, marries Garmund Hightower, and they have 6 daughters together. So House Hightower, even to this point, is actually fairly close to the Targaryens, kind of like House Velaryon was. Nowhere near like the degree that House Velaryon was, because they were seen like as off-brand Targaryens, so they would get married into them all the time out of just so the faith wasn't mad at them for incest. But the Hightowers, again, they were also marrying into the Targaryens quite a bit. Now, as I was like kind of pushing into, the next war that we would really see would be the first Blackfire Rebellion. And like so many other houses, House Hightower kind of played both sides. They were kind of sitting here going, okay, well, let's just act like we're for one side or the other. And at the end of the war, whoever starts winning, we'll just back them. It's very similar to Tywin and Robert's Rebellion, and House Hightower is able to keep their position, not really lose anything, but just kind of staying out of it and just playing neutral. And this will lead us to the Baratheon Age. Or quote unquote, when Robert's Rebellion happens. Again, there's a lot of information we just don't know about House Hightower in the middle of this. Because we don't have Fire and Blood Part 2, where we're going to have to update these videos, we just don't have a ton of information in between like the dance or Aegon III's reign and then Aerys II's reign. So for the most part, there were some minor things I maybe skipped over that were in there. For instance, when we see that Oberyn and Elya's mother goes there, and that a Hightower is supposed to be kind of the marriage broker to get Oberyn married to Cersei and Elya to Jaime, that happened at one point. There's just some minor things here and there that happened that I didn't think were important to discuss about the Hightowers that really mattered too much. But the Hightowers during Robert's Rebellion actually stayed loyal to the Mad King pretty much until the end. They had a great Kingsguard known as Gerald Hightower. He died at the Tower of Joy, or presumably died at the Tower of Joy, whichever theory you want to go off of that. Personally, I think he did die at the Tower of Joy, but you can go with that however you want. The Targaryens, after the Targaryens were defeated, the Hightowers then bend the knee to Robert. Nothing really too impactful happens here. Just wanted to throw that out there, that eventually the Hightowers do bend the knee, and this is actually I think really the only time where you can distinctively say House Hightower basically lost. Like, they picked the losing side. You could do an argument with the Dance of the Dragons, but they definitively lose here at this position. Now, interesting enough, when we get to the main story, the Hightowers, again, there's not a lot of information on them, like, leading up to, like, in between Robert's Rebellion and the main story. We just know the Hightowers are still listed as being as rich as House Lannister and being able to field 3 times the men as any other Tyrell bannerman. We also see that House Hightower has made very important marriages. So, Mace Tyrell's wife, Alari, I don't know how to say her name that well, but she is Lord Leighton's second daughter. So she is a Hightower, and she is married to the Lord of Highgarden. So a very important marriage there. And we see that at this point, that House Hightower is married into a bunch of important houses, and really there's nothing else to note here, is that Lord Leighton has been up in the High Tower and has not been seen in over a decade, which leads a lot of people to believe that he's either already dead, he's bedridden, maybe he's doing some sort of sorcery up there. We just don't know. And for me personally, I actually believe that Lord Leighton is dead. I think Lord Leighton is dead and that his wife has been ruling this whole time and kind of doing what she wants to do. But will House Hightower finally get involved in a major way in the next 2 books? And I think that is going to happen. House Hightower will, I think, have a confrontation with Euron Greyjoy, and I think will be the house to actually take him down. I think we'll see kind of a mixture of forces with some of the Tyrell forces and the the Tyrell and the Hightower forces take him down. And I think House Hightower will be a bit more active in the story, especially with when you think about how much significance George has placed on their house, going through and writing Fire and Blood, that I think maybe when he was first making the story, he just didn't have anything made up for House Hightower yet. And I think now that he does, I think we may see them having a more pivotal role in the story. So let me know what you guys think about House Hightower. I really enjoyed doing this video. I know it was a quite a long video. But yeah, I enjoyed doing their house. I don't know what house I'm going to do next. I wanted to do them just because it made sense to do them right after House Velaryon. But yeah, thank you guys all for watching the video, and I will see you guys all in the next video. Bye, guys.